Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you,
All right.
Pastor Daniel.
Pastor Jeff will now take off from here, and we are transitioning to a new phase in our study of the church, and he's going to tell you we've looked at some of the aspects of the early church, the history, the context, and now we're going to get into some other interesting areas. Okay, over to you, sir.
So, as Daniel suggested, we've been in a particular area of focus in our study for several months now. The whole year is dedicated to the church, dedicated to reflecting on the church. Where did the church come from? What's the nature of the church? What does the church believe? How does the church interact with the wider world? And what does it mean to be church for us today? So that's kind of the shape of what we're doing. We started by looking at lots of different angles of the context of the church when it first began and how that particular context shaped the life of the early believers and what it meant to do and be church. So after Easter, kind of the post-resurrection moment for us is asking the question, well, what did they believe? What was it that the early church, early Christians, what did they commit to? What is it that they gave themselves to? What was it that shaped them in their understanding of God, of themselves, of the world? What did they think? How did they think? And what shaped that thinking for them? And so for the next several weeks, we're going to be talking about the beliefs that dominated the early church and what it meant to confess or believe these things. You know, people used the term ideology from time to time to indicate a belief system that some large group of people cling to or advocate somewhere. And there were lots of theologies and ideologies during the life of the early church. And so we'll look at what it is that the early church had to say and what they believed and why they said it then and why they said it that way and why it was important to say it that way rather than another way. And it's all driven by an effort to convey the nature of the gospel. They're all trying to make sure that what they say conveys or crystallizes or captures the very essence of the gospel in their own time and place. And so we're going to be talking about that for the most part. And the most helpful way to do that well is for you to ask questions. Okay? So I don't want you to be shy about asking questions. That's the best way to move our study along, is for you to be bold enough to say, well, so why did they say this? Or did they believe this? Or isn't this what they believed? Or whatever. It doesn't matter. But if it's something that puzzles you or you're interested in or you want to understand, please ask about it, because that helps us move the class along. So we started with the social, political, and religious context of the early church, and we saw how different institutions and different social norms shaped the life of the early church. Now we turn to what they believed and how they came to say what they say. And so it's probably important to take a minute to think about, well, what kind of things did they believe and say before they met Jesus? Or what did they think and say as they met Jesus? And then, most importantly, what did they say after the ministry and death and resurrection of Jesus? So the earliest Christians were whom? Who were these people? Who were the earliest followers of Jesus? Okay, clearly they were Jews. What else? Okay, some were working class. That's correct. And who were they? fishermen, so they worked with their hands. They may have lived hand to mouth to a degree. Some may have invested in cooperatives that worked together as a fishing unit to bring in. Some had contracts to fish at certain times in certain places. You know, Sea of Galilee is only so big. Yes?
It seems like several of sort of the original followers had kind of portable work.
Yes?
To do wherever they found themselves. And there were several women of independent means.
Right.
Who were able to help get things started.
Right. So some of the earliest devotees to this strange new religion, or let me put it another way, some of the earliest devotees to this branch of Judaism, right? Because most people perceived it at that time as a branch of Judaism, which it was, because all the earliest believers were Jews. They all came from association with and beliefs associated with the synagogue. And so, as you suggest, many of the earliest ones came from kind of a working class background, but there were those who were wealthy, who hosted the early church. There were a few that were extremely well educated, like who? Paul. Some were well connected, like Matthew. Now, why would Matthew be well connected?
Well, he was a tax collector.
Of course.
So that was not a profession that would tend to align with what Jesus' teaching was about, the way tax collecting happened, with a lot of grift.
Yeah, you'd say that Jesus' teaching put Matthew in certain tension with his profession.
And Zacchaeus as well.
Sure,
So,
absolutely.
Do we have any understanding that they sort of left that profession and did something else, or did they just do it in a more godly way?
Well, clearly Matthew did.
Matthew left.
Matthew clearly left. Zacchaeus, yeah, you need to use the microphones, friends. I'm sorry. Is it on? I think it's on.
All right. You want me to repeat? Anyway.
Sure.
Yeah, so the question was, what do they, so I guess Matthew obviously went into full-time ministry after that. So he sort of shed his previous profession. Anyway, it's just,
Well,
I don't know about Zacchaeus, but it was a life-changing event. So some people everybody had a self-examination of what they had been doing up to that point, right?
Well, let's start with a yes and no here.
Okay.
So let's just go with Matthew as an example. So Matthew is a tax collector. Matthew lives, and you don't turn it off. Matthew lives in constant tension with what? His own community. The people from whom he came probably were not big fans of what Matthew was doing. But if you wanted to be wealthy, if you wanted to live well, if you wanted to live above hand to mouth, almost anyone who got on in this part of the world in Galilee had to do so in collaboration with the powers that be. And the powers that be dictated what you could and couldn't do. Now, in Galilee, it wasn't always as direct as it may have been in some areas. But let's just put it this way. Caesar always got his cut. Okay? Always got his cut. And that's precisely what created the environment in which, and to collect the taxes, Caesar used people who were from that region. Very often, the taxes collected for the temple were managed by the locals who were in deep collaboration with Rome, because you couldn't have that position unless you had the approval of Rome. So Matthew was like 3 to 4 tiers down in the structure, but it was a plum job. Why? Because he got to take a percentage cut of everybody else's cut. And so he did very well. And as you suggest, Jesus' teachings were in tension with Matthew's position. However, and this is where I would invite caution. You said Matthew left to go into the ministry. Well, maybe. Remember how the disciples experienced Jesus. Think about how they experienced Jesus. Imagine Matthew as one whose mindset is that it's their ambition to get on in the world. That's Matthew's mindset, more or less. So why might Jesus be attractive?
Get in on the ground floor.
Yes, sir, Buddy Bob. Get in on the ground floor of this movement. And what was it that Jesus was doing that suggested that one might want to be a part of this franchise? What did Matthew see that may have suggested to him that you don't want to miss out on this?
The disciples thought that
They thought that he was going to form a new regime and that, they'd be part of that new regime.
Right. Oh is right.
The head of the Department of Treasury or something.
Brother, you're on something. You're exactly right. There's this growing perception that what we have stumbled upon or what we've been invited to. Remember, he was invited. And he's seen enough to confirm the wisdom of his decision. Huge crowds, miraculous events, thronging souls who are in favor of. Now, a guy like Matthew's going to be thinking, what? We can monetize this whole thing. Now, I don't want to, I'm playing a little bit with this. You see that. But the notion of a new regime, positions of priority. Remember, a couple of the disciples were arguing with each other about who would be the highest in the new order of things. And maybe he was just a fool. I mean, maybe he was just taken in by the charisma. And do you remember, there were movements in the 80s. I won't call their name for fear some of us may have participated in them. Okay? I'm not going to name them. But you would have these charismatic industries emerge. And you'd have this personality. And people would flock to this personality, and they would join their organization, and they would become a cog in this wider thing that it wasn't just making money. It had a whole narrative, a whole kind of philosophy of life that came with it. I'm sorry?
Are you talking about pyramid schemes?
Well, some of them functioned as pyramid schemes. But my point is that it came with a certain allure of both economic and social advance, plus this philosophy of living differently, right? And so Matthew could easily have been someone whose commitments, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Let's say his tax business was just doing okay, or that he was feeling a little bit like things weren't going great. This looks like a good option. He goes in with Jesus, and it looks like a good decision. When they're outside the walls of Jerusalem before the week of Passover, looks like a pretty good decision. Similarly with the fishermen. What might the fishermen have been thinking? It's one of the reasons I like watching The Chosen. Have you seen that show? Because it plays with these human instincts, these human impulses that You know, we're not singular creatures. We have mixed motives all the time, and they're complicated. Go ahead.
Well, Peter was sort of the other extreme, that he was not a scholar. He was
No.
not well learned. He had help writing whatever he wrote,
Right.
but he was still a church leader, and
Correct.
so
But why might Peter have been drawn to this movement early on? Beats the heck out of getting up at 4 a.m. I mean, remember, when Jesus and his group went to places, what happened? People took care of you. People fed them. People housed them. People welcomed them. People treated them like they were somebody. That's hard to do when you're up at 4 a.m. and fish till 2 in the afternoon and don't come up with a lot. Or you have to share it out with your cooperative because that's the way they did it in those days. It's hard. If you know any communities that are around the fishing industry, it's hard, hard, hard work. And Joanne?
Yeah, I was actually, believe it or not, thinking Scientology. I was thinking about how people, you know, they get that lure of Scientology and they're going to be taken care of, and I don't know. That's just what I was thinking about.
There's one other figure, Simon, among the disciples. Simon was a zealot. Simon was all in it for the politics, the promise of a new regime. He wasn't interested in the money. He wasn't interested in the fame, but he was interested in political change. And he saw Jesus as a figure who could be the prospect of radical change. Yes?
like many of them, he wanted to get rid of the Rome.
Absolutely. Which takes me to another pre-resurrection moment. All of them having been raised in a Jewish world, all of them having been raised in close proximity to Judea, if not Judea itself, they were all affiliated with, in one way or another, either closely or indirectly, the Jewish history, the Jewish story, the Jewish narrative, the Jewish temple cult, the Jewish synagogue. It was all part of who they were. Even if they didn't want to be a part of it, they couldn't help but be. It's like growing up in the South when I was a kid, you know. In certain areas, you know, Baptists and Pentecostals were all you were going to find. Anything else struck you as alien, right? So they grew up in a very particular world religiously. Now, up in Galilee, you had some cultural diversity to a degree. In other words, the Greeks and Romans who were in the area, they followed pagan gods. But those within the Jewish, you might say the influence of Jewish religion and society, they're all familiar with the mindset. And part of that mindset, or part of that cultural life together, was the expectation that God was going to intervene at some point and get rid of this radical oppression that they all suffered. They all had a lively sense that at some point, and some were truer believers than others, but they all had this lively notion that God is going to send somebody, his man, the Son of Man, a Messiah, to reverse the order of things and the Jews be free once again. So that's kind of running in the background. Now, Paul, very well educated, he's a Pharisee, and he has certain beliefs that distinguish him from, say, the Sadducees or other brands of Judaism. So the Sadducees, they're the ones who kind of controlled life around the temple. They don't believe in a resurrection at all, of any kind. The Pharisees believed in a resurrection in the final days. And this, of course, was a matter of considerable debate during Jesus' day. And we don't know where the disciples come down on this either way. And they may not have, because neither of them, any of them are seemingly religiously employed. The earliest disciples, the 12, they may have not had an opinion about it. But it was part of the conversation in the early life of the church. So we've identified, what may have been some of the ideas or pre-resurrection notions that would have informed and motivated these earliest disciples. They get to Jerusalem. They all experience Jesus' passion. He's arrested. His arrest occasions their scattering, their denial, their betrayal. I mean, Judas is a clear example of someone whose motives are mixed at best. But they all run away. They're all hiding at this point. And then Jesus is crucified. Now, what did crucifixion say in the context of their upbringing? Yes.
That's a bad person.
Well, it's a cursed person.
Yeah.
Yes.
Cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree.
Thank you. That's exactly right. And they all knew it. If they did, let's just assume for the sake of argument that they didn't believe that God had cursed them. Although they might have thought, oh my goodness, we've been hanging with somebody who was cursed of God. They might have known that he was socially cursed. In other words, it's just like when you find out that, in a family, that one of your family members has gone to prison. And people start acting really weird around the immediate family members of the person who went to prison, as if the person who went to prison going to prison has somehow changed the people that he was or she was living with. And people start avoiding them and not treating them the same, or not knowing, not knowing what to say. Well, the disciples were the closest people to Jesus for years. So they now are associated with someone who's cursed, socially, culturally. And all of this is informing their way of thinking. And it's the same old story. See, that's what's so fascinating to me, is that it's the same old story. Movements come up. Movements have charismatic leaders. People affiliate with all kinds of mixed motives. They're all trying to figure out where they are, what's their position in the wider movement. And then, bam, bam, Jesus shows up. Now, it's hard for me to convey the magnitude of Jesus showing up. Let's just think about this for a minute. You've gone to your uncle's funeral. There's a wedding 2 weeks later of your niece. Everybody goes to the wedding of this cousin, niece, friend, relative. And who shows up? But the uncle who was dead 2 weeks ago. And everybody went to the funeral. Think about how radical that must seem. Now, it's not that they haven't already seen something like this. They have. His name's Lazarus. Now, if I'm Lazarus, I'm a little freaked out myself, right? The people who know Lazarus, however, just imagine what the disciples must have thought. What do you think they would have said to themselves about Lazarus?
Before Jesus' resurrection?
Yeah. Because Lazarus is raised from the dead, like a week before.
Well, just being a human being, maybe they thought he really hadn't really passed away.
That's right. They probably thought, he couldn't have been dead. He just couldn't have been. That might have been one of the first reactions. Yeah.
Well, the other point that's sometimes overlooked is when Jesus was crucified, there was an earthquake and the tombs were open and a lot of people got up out of the grave and wandered around Jerusalem, which should have been of interest to some people.
Could have been crazy at the next meeting of the synagogue. That's right. So the first thought might be, well, that's incredible that he survived. This might be one way that they thought about it, that he survived his death.
I would imagine back then they didn't know everything about the body. They may have buried a lot of people who aren't actually dead, and especially if it's just in a tomb where there's air.
Right. And some scholars have suggested that the Jewish conception of death is different than ours. You can be dead without being dead, right? Biologically dead. Yeah, go ahead.
I was reading in Luke the account of Passion Week, and here was Jesus on the poor side of town riding into Jerusalem.
Right,
on a
the small gate.
And on the other end, the Roman authoritarian figures were kind of keeping an eye on
Everything.
Passover week and want to make sure things were going to not veer out of control, and they were going to quash it. And they were not just concerned about Jesus. They singled out Lazarus because the crowd was in a frenzy because they saw Lazarus and Jesus spent, the day before with the family. And so they conspired. They said, we must remove this man Jesus and Lazarus as well. So I'm surmising that at this point, Lazarus is in hiding.
Could well be, because all of the disciples were in hiding. In fact, everyone associated with Jesus had backed way away from their public presence, in a city that had the week before just been filled with people from everywhere. Well, now they're all going back. But people are keeping a really low profile because this is not good.
And I just wanted to raise one other point, and that is that it's important to understand that all the disciples had their own motivation to follow Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
But Jesus knew their hearts. He didn't just pick them randomly. He was like, you're on my team, you guys, I'll make you fishers of men. So he understood that they're works in progress, and he is going to make that progress while, during his ministry. But he saw something in each of them, including Judas, that would fulfill the will of God eventually. And Judas' role played out, but he used each and every one of them. It wasn't so much that they chose Jesus. They may have felt like they chose Jesus for whatever motive, but in reality, they were chosen handpicked by God.
Right. I mean, this is a side point, but where Judas is concerned, it's interesting to me that Jesus picks a man who has the capacity to betray someone closest to him. And yet he welcomes him to his table. Doesn't run him out, shares the cup with him, shares the bread with him, doesn't run him out. This is important. So he chose him because of the kind of person he was. Not for what Judas could do. Well, in a sense, what he could do, which is betray his closest friend. Only to display the magnitude of God's grace. by receiving him, you see. But further to my point is, it's not that they're unacquainted with the notion of people being dead and being brought back to life. But there's one further step in this that we're going to get to in just a minute. This is where it gets radical. Because Jesus has encountered Mary and others after his death and sent them to speak to the disciples. And how do they react to this? They're unbelieving. Of course they're unbelieving, because they're not irrational. Who's going to believe this? It was one thing for Jesus to raise Lazarus, but it's quite another thing for Jesus to be raised, and who's there to raise him? And he's going to, and so they're all huddled up. We'll get into this more in a sermon today, but they're all huddled up. They're in hiding. And the scripture says that he appeared to them, that he came to them. And the doors were shut, and yet there he is. And it becomes increasingly evident that whatever happened to Jesus is not the same kind of thing that happened to Lazarus. Lazarus was raised to die again. Jesus was raised to live. And as this begins to dawn on the disciples, what's happened, what it does is this crazy, radical moment of resurrection casts a light back on the whole of Jesus' ministry. And what it does is it brings light into the minds and heart of the disciples in places that up to this point they may not have been able to perceive. But one way to look at it or to talk about it is it's God's vindication of everything Jesus said and did. And the overcoming of death, not death in terms of being resuscitated, but death as such, death as a human threat, as a threat to a human being, has been overcome. Which changes how one perceives this cursed cross. It changes how people perceive Jesus' generosity and ministry. It changes how they perceive the things that Jesus did that they thought were probably, a little out there, like turning the table over in the temple. It changes how they think about what he was aiming for. And so now, and the point is, come on in, brother. Now the point is that here you have fishermen and tax collectors and political operatives all bound together by what? By this experience of this thing that they call the resurrection of Jesus. And what they confess, what they say, what dominates them, for them, this is cataclysmic. The world has changed. God has acted in the world in a way that they had always hoped God would, but didn't know how it was going to happen. And now they've experienced God acting in the world in a manner that is so radical that it changes their whole conception of what life itself is. That's what we're talking about. How they understand life at all has changed. And that God is the one at the center of this doing. And so it's what we call a conversion. Their hearts and minds are radically altered, transformed in the moment of this revelation. It's a revelation. And having an experience that is that extraordinary is a little bit disruptive. to your ordinary way of thinking and doing. And so now the question is, we've looked at what they might have been thinking and how they might have been thinking and what they believed and how they would have been related to Jesus. What happens next? What are the earliest things that Christians say about this Jesus? Because now everything's different than it was. And this is where we need to spend our time. The end of today and much of next week. What are the earliest things the church, the followers of Jesus, now want to say? What do you think some of those things are?
That he was truly the Messiah.
Yes? Go ahead.
I mean, Peter, for one, was on fire.
Oh, my God.
After Pentecost. I mean, there was no stopping them.
That's right.
They were sure now,
Right.
it seemed, that Jesus was the Son of God. And
Right.
they were convicted and wanted other people to know it.
Right. So what is it that everyone could agree on? What notions or knowledge of this event could everyone agree on? Well, there was this guy Jesus, right? And he was from Galilee. And he was an itinerant rabbi. And that he was a wonder worker. And that he was arrested. That he was brutally punished. That he was crucified. And that he was buried. These are what you might call world historical facts. There's really no dispute about it. I mean, there's been some back and forth, but even today, non-Christian scholars will tell you in a heartbeat, yeah, that much we can agree on. Yes?
Well, and they needed to emphasize that he had grown up as a human being, had lived among them as a human being, and that he was resurrected as a human being.
Right.
That
Now,
they touched him.
that's right. Now that the need to emphasize that will come a little later. But I'm trying to, you know how cosmologists, is that what they're called? The guys that are the astrophysicists or whoever, the ones that are trying to figure out, get back to the Big Bang, and now they talk about, we're all the way back to the first half second, but we don't know what to say about that yet. Okay, so we're trying to talk about, just for a little while, what was the earliest things that these guys would say in the wake or in the light of the resurrection? Yeah.
How about he is risen?
Okay.
They thought their movement was dead.
Done.
Dead as that person hanging on the cross.
Right.
And they're like, well, that's it. I guess we go back to our day jobs after kind of being in hiding for a little
Well, they
while.
did.
Yeah.
They
and
went
kinda
back to their day
back.
jobs.
And-
They went back to Galilee and started fishing again.
And then the resurrection changed everything, and they realized their movement was just beginning, and they were so elated that's
Right.
what came out of their mouth is he is risen.
Right. But the weirdness of it is that all of their preconceived notions about where this thing was going were radically subverted by the cross. The cross stopped all of them in their tracks with their own petty ambitions or dreams of what might be, or the idea that God, this expectation that they'd had for 500 years as a culture, that God was radically going to intervene and liberate them from their oppressors, and now they were going to be the dominant political power in the region. And the cross becomes the point of departure for all of their thinking, because it's precisely the resurrection that shines a light on the cross as not being a curse, but being something God did for a reason. And that this dude is the Messiah. And no one ever had an expectation of a Messiah who is crucified. Nobody. But yet there he is. Not only is he there, he appears to them And the appearances to them are overwhelming. Completely overwhelming. And it sets the foundation for how they'll go on to react and to speak and to think from this. And the things that they say is that God raised Jesus from the dead. They don't say that Jesus raised himself from the dead. They say God raised Jesus from the dead. That's the earliest confession of the church. He is risen. And so that becomes the basis for what happens next. Because what does the earliest church do? What does the early church, what do all these people do? Do they spread out and start setting up their own resurrection franchise? That's right, not yet. What is the core activity that takes place immediately following Jesus' appearance to them?
Meeting in houses and sharing meals together.
They keep grouping up. They hang close together. They take care of each other. They eat together. They pray together. They go somewhere early on Sundays and they start singing psalms, which they all grew up singing, and hymns and spiritual songs to Jesus as if a God. We have that from outside of the Bible. The secular commentator says that they huddle up together on Sunday, on the first day of the week, early, and they pray and sing to this Christus as if a God. Yeah, they do. Now, it's one thing to believe that Jesus is a figure who is going to radically alter our political and social circumstance and put everything right, to saying that this figure is God himself. That's a big claim. That's a big thing to say. But that's what they say. And they say it with more than their mouths. They say it with what they do. They come together, they feast together, they pray together, and they worship together this Jesus. Now, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, because what I'm talking about now is probably, we'll develop that next week. We've still got an intermittent period, right? And I don't want you to miss this. That Jesus appears to the disciples more than once. He appears to as many as 500, saith Paul. But he spends weeks with them. Weeks with them until what? Pentecost. He spent weeks with them, preparing them, teaching them about himself in relation to the what? The scriptures, what we would call the Old Testament. He spends weeks preparing them, teaching them, instructing them, helping them see, now that they've experienced the risen Christ, the light that sheds on the whole of the Old Testament. And notice in Paul, you see it in Paul all the time, how Paul is picking up these elements from the Old Testament and interpreting them in the light of the cross. All of Paul's letter to the Corinthians, is just banging on the way a knowledge of the cross of Jesus and the reality of his resurrection changes the way we see our faith. All right, so I'm going to stop there. We got 5 minutes. Questions of any kind? Yes.
I just wondered, did they continue going to the Sabbath and, I mean, honoring all that as well as the new?
Yes and no. So it would appear that, like for many of us, once you've become a follower of Jesus, it's not like you can create a vacuum of your life. All their lives they had gone to the synagogue. I fully imagine that for the Jewish members of Jesus' followers, they may have gone to the synagogue more after this. But they got together as a group on Sunday because at the synagogue, nobody's acknowledging Jesus as the Messiah. But they may have gone there to worship on Saturday and then on Sunday mornings gotten together and sung songs and hymns and spiritual songs because they're the ones who had experienced this thing. And it'll be some time before Christians and Jews separate. They will be perceived as, they were called the Way. They were eventually called Christians, right? Followers of Christ. But they were perceived in the society and within Judaism as a branch of Judaism, just like Pharisaism or Sadduceeism or the Essenes, who were the kind of monkish group that lived in the desert waiting for the coming of the Messiah. They would have been seen as Jewish. And the earliest controversies, and we'll talk about this, the earliest things that they had to sort out was how Jewish do we have to be as a follower of Jesus? That was a big deal. Very early on. Do we keep going to synagogue? Do we keep following the dietary laws? Paul, interestingly enough, someone said something about who God picks, God picks Paul, who was one of the most radical enforcers of the law. God picks him to bring on to the side of the church because he's the one who's going to have to articulate why that doesn't matter anymore. But he understood it, down to his corpuscles. Other questions or comments? Curiosities?
I was wondering, just being there, thinking about it, Jesus died on the cross and the earth shook, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the earth shook. The veil was torn.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like just a small group of people. So I'm thinking about that and thinking, people would have had to also consider those things happening when they found out that he had risen.
Yeah.
It wasn't just like, he's here, he's risen. There were other things leading up to that too, major things.
But as Christians, we always have a bias towards believing that people are going to experience those events as pointers too. But if I'm a Roman soldier and the earth shakes when Jesus dies, I'm on my cell phone to my wife, are the kids okay? I'm not thinking about the Son of God. You see my point? In other words, it's only the resurrection that makes all that other stuff have a certain sense. And that's, from a psychological and spiritual standpoint, this is ground zero, the resurrection. And when you see how that shapes everything after that, if you don't appreciate how that shapes everything after that, then a lot of things Christians will say down the line won't make any sense. You can't tie it all together. Yeah.
So, I'm a time, what do you call it?
Traveler?
No, I look at everything in time,
Oh, okay.
So,
a historical perspective.
Historical perspective. So I want you again to emphasize that he did not ascend to his Father right after he
No.
resurrected. It was
Weeks.
weeks, if
Yeah.
not months.
Oh, a month and a week.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
50
and,
days.
And so he made all these contacts with people. And so, yeah, that's a big deal.
It's a big deal. All right, so we will reconvene next week, and we will start looking now. Now we're into the early church. We'll look at what those early church beliefs were, and what were they inclined to say, and why they said it. Because what they said influences us today, what we've committed to as Christians. All right? Thank you.